Hello, my friends. Laurie Ashcraft here again. I'm your host for Viva La Evolution, which is produced by Recovery and Resilience Solutions, which is a training and consulting branch of Crestwood Behavioral Health. You'll notice that we have some lovely sponsors. So grateful to them. And more subscribers. And it would really help us out if you subscribed. So please subscribe and tell your friends. It's just a thing, it's just a podcast thing. I can't explain it. It just helps everything. So I know I say this about all of my guests, but today I have a really interesting and wonderful guest. Someone that you might not have ever even heard of, by the name of Alex Barnard. This is his book, Conservatorship Inside California's System of Coercion and Care for Mental Illness. You'll hear from Alex himself that he has had a firsthand experience of what it's like to live with a mental illness, as have I, and actually everyone on the RRS team. That's one of our bonding elements, is that we all come from that place. We all have our ITE degree, which is I'm the evidence. So Alex is one of us. He's a brilliant young man, and this book is based on his dissertation from Berkeley. And he does an amazing job of looking at the whole issue of conservatorship from every angle. And those of you who know me know that anything that restricts rights really pushes my buttons. I just have a knee-jerk reaction to it. And then I am often humbled by the fact that I can't think of a better solution offhand for many people who wouldn't consent to being treated otherwise. Now, how they're treated is an issue that is real important to me. That's why I'm so aligned with Crestwood and loving the values that we have. We're not perfect, and we're still stumbling around, making mistakes and all that stuff, but our heart is always with the person and trying to get it right. You'll see that throughout. If I were you, I would go out and I'd buy this book if you want to understand this stuff. I've got all the pages turned down. Gene's read it, and he's got his pages turned down. I don't know which is his or mine anymore, but anyway, they're all good. So, what this did for me is it showed me, the whole picture, the beginning and the end, how it came into be, how it helps some people, how it hurts some people, and some really new good ideas about how to make it work better. So I know you're going to enjoy listening to Alex. I try not to interrupt him too many times because he's so good, but I couldn't help it. So you'll just have to put up with me doing that. And okay, let's just get on with it. And thanks for being here. Okay, here we go. So Alex, thank you so much for being willing to join us today. I know you've got a full teaching load and a bunch of other stuff going on, and I'm just really grateful that you had time to spend with us this afternoon, especially after, reading your book, which was so informative and thoughtful on conservatorship. Thank you so much for writing this book. I haven't seen anything like this. Nobody has been interested enough that I know of to write this kind of thoughtful, well-balanced book. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I think I
Well,
mentioned
thank you so much for
oh,
having me and for having taken the time to read the book. And the kind of feedback from people who have this direct experience of how the system functions, it's my toughest audience and the audience where it's the most rewarding to hear that I got the story more or less right.
yeah. Oh, well, I think you absolutely did. So no question about that. I was thinking about where we could start. And maybe a good place, if it sounds right to you, is if you could just talk a little bit about how you got a passion for this to begin with, and tell us a little bit about the route you followed to come up with the book and do your research.
So I think often when I get that question, there's a little bit of digging for, why are you interested in mental illness, this topic that is often so marginalized and stigmatized. I grew up with a lot of mental illness around me. My grandmother spent serious time in a state hospital, and my brother lives with pretty serious psychiatric disabilities, and I myself have grappled with mental illness for my whole life. So when I was looking for a dissertation topic, I'm somebody who's interested in the way public programs work and social policy happens. And I think mental illness is such an interesting point of confluence, that mentally ill people, it's not just that they're interacting with the medical system, but they're interacting with our welfare system, they're interacting with the criminal justice system. So if you want to understand how government works and how social policies work in the US, looking at what happens to people with mental illness, I think is just this really powerful lens to make sense of that. How did I get interested in conservatorship is even a little bit narrower. So I had been studying the issue of the mental health system in France and the United States. That was my work at UC Berkeley for my PhD. But towards the end of that, I started to hear about a conversation happening in San Francisco about expanding the use of conservatorship to deal with what anyone in the Bay Area can see everywhere all the time, which is that there are people who are really struggling on the streets, and it's not always obvious what they're struggling with. We attributed a lot of it to mental illness, but they're also struggling with poverty and racism and having been incarcerated and substance use. But in any case, there's this discussion of expanding conservatorship. That bill ultimately was SB 1045, passed in 2018. And I went onto Google Scholars, like, well, here's this thing, conservatorship. We're talking about expanding it. What do we know about it? And the answer was really very little in the academic world. And with some research assistants, we said, well, what does the state publish about conservatorship? What do we know about how conservatorship this is currently functioning, this thing we're expanding? And there's no doubt. You, there was no report saying this is how many people are conserved or where they are, or these are the outcomes. And so it was that incredible lack of visibility and accountability that drove my interest in this project from the beginning. And then, of course, you have Britney Spears. Her conservatorship comes to light in 2021, and all of a sudden, I think this clicked for a lot of people that there's a real phenomenon here. There's something we really need to understand. That on one hand, we have these people dying on the streets and we say we need to conserve them. And on the other hand, you have these people who seem to be stuck in these abusive, overly paternalistic, controlling guardianships for way too long.
Yeah, yeah.
And how do we make sense of both of those things? And that's what, I tried to do with this book.
Well, you did a great job with it. I learned so much. I thought I knew all about it, but then I realized I didn't really know a lot, even though I've been around forever. I just took for granted a lot of things without thinking about where it came from. And from my point of view, I did my dissertation on freedom, and I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, um, right, right when it collapsed. But I have had this thing about freedom forever, and when I look at conservatorship or locked programs, the first thing I want to do is take them apart and not like them, and just see them as a lazy way of solving a problem. If we were willing to get in there with a real relationship with people, we wouldn't need to do these things. But I have to concede that, when I listen to my friend Mark Reagan talk about what he sees on the streets with people who really need to be treated and aren't willing to, it's just I don't know what to do with it. I mean, I have to put aside my own stuff about unlocking everybody and setting everybody free against what's practical. And I think we need conservatorship, but it needs to be re-engineered significantly. It needs to be measured and accounted for.
I think there's two things that often get mixed up in these conversations. I really appreciate that reflection. I mean, one is about whether involuntary treatment is sort of inherently needs to be part of our response to severe mental illness. And you can point to brain scans that show that people have anosognosia, which means that they don't recognize their illness. And I think when you interview families in particular, this is just incredibly real to them that they have. In the book, I profile families that fight really hard to get their kids into the best voluntary outpatient services out there. They're convinced that their children do way better when they're on medication, and kid just says no, just turns it all down, and has all these sort of disastrous outcomes in their life, from incarceration to hospitalization to death in some cases. And so we have this narrative that forced treatment is just inevitable for some people. And I think whether or not that's true, I think it's not true for most people, even living with the most severe mental illnesses. And I think if you talk to people doing the ground work on the ground, kind of what you're talking about, that there are ways to build relationships and connect with people, even if they don't have insight, even if they don't accept that they have a mental illness, but to say, well, you do have needs and we're going to help you meet those needs. So I don't think huge amounts of conservatorship or involuntary treatment are inevitable. But I think there's a separate issue, which is what do we do now, in the sense that there might be a lot of people in California who 30 years ago, we could have built that relationship. We could have gotten them into voluntary services had we tried, had the services been available, had we funded housing. But now they've been on the street for 30 years. They've been failed and burned by the system. They've been, left to deteriorate. Living with psychosis is really scary, and living with that for a long time really does make you potentially paranoid and hostile. And so there's a discussion about what our ideal mental health service system would look like. And then there's this discussion about how much conservatorship do we need right now with the reality of the people of, the state of a lot of people in California. And I think that's a different question, one where I think the kind of idealism of throw open all the gates and move to a purely voluntary system and just build relationships. I think that should be that should be what our vision for the system. But I certainly ran into a lot of cases researching this book where that just didn't seem like a serious option.
I know. I have to
There's
agree.
no easy narrative for some of these cases.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying, and I've said this too when I look from my perspective, is the people that we're serving right now that are, I'm not going to call them resistant. I'm going to call them who have learned to stick up for themselves to survive. Because the community system has failed them. It's not them that have failed, it's that the system failed them. And now we're stuck with people who have legitimate beliefs about what works for them. It might not be what we believe, but from their point of view, they haven't been given any alternatives that really work.
Yeah, it's deeply unfair. I mean, at the book, I end with the conclusion very uncomfortably saying, with the world as it is, with the system as it is, I think there are probably currently more people in California who need conservatorship than are getting it. And I don't think it had to be that way. I think we could have avoided this situation, but I think that's the situation we're in. And maybe you think that's wrong, but I don't think that's the long-term case. And again, it's not fair. It's we've failed you, and now we're saying we're going to force you under conservatorship. It's deeply, deeply unfair.
Yeah.
And yet, I think that has to be part of kind of the state making up for its past failures.
Well, if it was making up for them, I'd be happy, but it's
Right.
not making up for them. It's just another example of blaming the person and taking all the rights away, locking them up. But
Well, and I think
you
that's
know,
part of how we could rethink conservatorship, because
okay.
what we talk about, coercion or forced treatment or involuntary treatment, it's all mixed together and they mean sort of different things. But we talk about it as if it's one thing. One public guardian said it, we think about it as a light switch. It's like either you are not gravely disabled and you do what you want, or you're gravely disabled and all of your rights disappear all at once. And I think the models for conservatorship that are uh, that I think have a little bit more promise are the ones that really think about, okay, what is it that this particular individual isn't able to do for themselves that we want to step in on? And it might be medication, it might be housing, it might be money management, but maybe it's not all of them at once. And that maybe even somebody within a conservatorship can be granted the right to make decisions. We want them to be making as
Mm-hmm.
many decisions
Mm-hmm.
for themselves as possible, because someday they're going to get off conservatorship and make decisions.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to imagine we're going to take away all your decision making power now, and someday we're going to give it all back and think that
Mm-hmm.
that's going to go well. So I think there are much smarter ways to do conservatorship, including, some counties think that all conservatees need to be in a locked facility. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a huge mistake. I think there are people who need the support of conservatorship and could be in a more intermediate or unlocked setting. And they're all people, also again, people who need help with decisions, but it doesn't need to come in the form of taking decision making capacity away from them. And it could come in the form of a psychiatric advance directive or some model like supported decision making taken from the developmental disability system. So I think we need a system that doesn't have a totally binary view of voluntary, involuntary, coercive, not coercive, and recognizes that a lot of things for people with mental illness, but just human beings in general, are in the middle, where
Yep.
we're making decisions, but there's pressure on us, there's incentives on us.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we make decisions on our own, sometimes we make decisions with the supports of other people. And we need to, have conservatorship reflect that messy reality.
So I love what you're saying, and I'm gonna say it back. At least my take on it is maybe there's a ramp up to conservatorship and a ramp off. And the
Yeah.
ramp up is as we see people struggling with various parts of their life, we could step in and I don't know if it's an advanced directive, but some way to just have that part held accountable, that part. And then that doesn't just cause the person to do something, it causes us to do something more with that person around that particular thing, whether it's money management or medication or whatever it is. Then if they have to go into conservatorship, okay, let's keep it as short as we can. Then there's a ramp out that starts ramping down on the control.
Yeah.
Like they start to get the right back to work, the right to manage their money, the right to. I think that's a good idea.
Well, I think the good news is that, in the book, I take to task the level of fragmentation in California, the fact that people's civil rights vary by zip code, that in some counties, conservatorship means something totally different. The judge in one county says, if you can't pitch a tent, you're gravely disabled, and another county has a different standard. And I think that in general, these are civil liberties that are too important to leave up to that level of, variability. But I do think the advantage of having this fragmented system is that we do have counties that are experimenting with different ways of doing conservatorship. And I think there are promising alternatives. Fresno, their RISE program is really focused on this idea of maximizing people's decision making. And I think one role that the state could be playing, and it isn't, is evaluating these models and publicizing them, and training people on them in a way that would make a conservatorship system that is a bit more evidence-based.
I know about the RISE program, but I can't read. Is it a peer-run program?
It's not, but it pairs clinicians with public guardians, and their idea is that gives the public, that it creates a situation where each time the public guardian wants to sort of override that person's decision and make a decision for them, the clinician can say, well, let's evaluate really what is going into their decisions
Oh,
psychologically, and
yeah,
is
yeah.
this something actually where they do have capacity to make that decision. Again,
Mm-hmm.
it still has this, it's still paternalistic, it's still conservatorship, but it's an
Mm-hmm.
attempt to have a more individualized approach. And they've also kind of moved towards a much more strengths-based focus as opposed to a deficits-based focus. And that's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
also, really promising,
Yeah,
exciting.
that sounds good. Yeah. I would love to see a peer in that mix.
I am not sure actually whether they use peers, but absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I can find it, but there's a place in your book where you quote, I think it's the American Psychiatric Association, around all the um, all the things that happen to a person. They're like determinants. Do you remember
Social
that?
determinants of
Yeah.
health. Yeah.
Do you remember? Can you quote what you said? Because I don't think I can
It's
find.
292. As the American Psychiatric Association itself recognized in a recent report, poverty and associated variables like unemployment, income, or education have the most robust effect on inpatient admission and should be prioritized.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That gets back to us saying, if the community had worked, if these things had been addressed in the community, then maybe we wouldn't end up with a conservatorship situation.
I think that's absolutely true, but again, I worry sometimes there's a little bit of hand waving that happens there, which is that opponents of conservatorship say that and say that if we had addressed poverty, if we'd addressed racism, we wouldn't be in this mess. And they're absolutely right. But I don't think that immediately gets us out of this mess. So I think we should address
Yeah.
poverty and we should address racism, no question. And that will
Yeah.
help us further down the line.
Yeah.
And it will help us right now. But
Mm-hmm.
it those sort of really broad social reforms still don't help us resolve these really specific cases
No,
of individuals with
no.
very high needs
Yeah.
who are, for totally legitimate reasons that may or may not have anything to do with their mental illness, are refusing care that we think is really essential for them. And that dilemma is just there.
It is.
And
We can argue about how it got started and mistakes made early on, but bottom line is it's here, like you're
yeah,
saying. And it's we might not have caused it, but it's up to us to work with it and try to fix it. There's a story you have in here about Crestwood, and since I work a lot with Crestwood, I wanted to just have you maybe speak to it. It's on page 193. This is about trying Laura on Clozaril. Do you want to talk about that story?
well, these are pseudonyms, and this came from a longtime public guardian I interviewed named Debbie. And I thought her case was interesting because, being a guardian or conservator gives you all these powers on paper that you can decide to put somebody in a locked facility, you can order medication, again, you control somebody's social security check. But actually, that power on paper doesn't necessarily translate into power in the real world, because you actually need all of these institutions to cooperate with you. You can't put somebody in a locked facility unless you find a facility that's willing to take the person.
Mm-hmm.
And you can order somebody on medication, but it doesn't, they don't have to take that medication unless some doctor actually prescribes it
Mm-hmm.
uh, for you. And in Debbie's case, she was talking about somebody who, there are many people like this in every county who are just, bouncing between all of these different settings, between shelters and hospitals and ERs and jails. And Debbie was convinced this individual needed Clozaril, which is kind of a, particularly complex and particularly potent antipsychotic. And there's some resistance to using it because it can have very serious side effects. So it needs to be carefully monitored. And she, basically had to shop around to find a doctor in a facility that was willing to try this. That a lot of them said, well, she's too unstable. It's too risky. And I think and eventually this person did get on Clozaril. They eventually got into a facility and graduated to less restrictive facilities, locked to unlocked. And Debbie talks about eventually this woman, wrote a lot of poetry and put together a book. Somebody in the facility put it together in a book, and it was dedicated to Debbie, to her conservator. And I
Yeah.
think what it speaks to is the really effective conservators are not the ones who say, I have this court order, you do what I tell you. It's the
Right.
ones who actually work as a recognize that that actually isn't, that doesn't accomplish nearly as much as it sounds like. And that actually the power of the conservator is as an advocate, that
Mhm, mhm.
they use the legal tools they have to push for the system to meet the needs of someone, and are doing a lot to coordinate this super fragmented system that has a lot of inertia in it.
Yeah. I just love this story, because it's such a good example of what an effective conservator can do. Um, and it's based on relationship building.
Yeah.
Without that, not much else works.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, given what we've talked about so far, what are we missing that you think we should add?
Well, I think we beforehand had a conversation that I think is a really important conversation, given right now California is about to vote on this Proposition 1, which is the $6 billion bond initiative that would be building beds. And everyone says we need more beds, but as somebody I interviewed, Chad Costello at Casra, told me a bed is just a mattress. A bed doesn't mean anything to say we need more beds. We're not spending $6 billion to buy mattresses. We're spending $6 billion to buy beds in certain kinds of facilities, and not all facilities are created equal. You know, different levels of care, what level of care a bed is in matters, but also who runs at a given level of care, who's running those beds. And so I think having conversation about what is actually happening, particularly in locked facilities,
Mm-hmm.
and what could make what's happening in those. I mean, I think when we put somebody in a locked facility, that creates an incredible obligation on us, the people who have taken away that person's civil liberties, to be making sure that that facility is really meeting their needs and getting them out as fast as possible. And I personally have visited some of these locked step down facilities called IMDs, or mental health rehabilitation centers, Institute of Mental Diseases, called different things, and been really shocked in some of them by what I've seen. So places where you see a physician once a month, where there's no individual psychotherapy, that everything is being done by sort of untrained staff running groups that some people I interviewed say they were just inane.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've talked to people who have been in some of these facilities and found them really supportive and intensive, and they learn tons of skills and they develop connections to other people there, and they appreciate the structure, the clarity about goals. And so this question of like what makes a good facility and how can we make these facilities better, I think is a really important question. Some people might reject that question. They might say, we just shouldn't have locked facilities. But I think sometimes that perspective, uh, you know, blocks us from asking, some ways, the more nuanced question of, how could these facilities be better,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and what makes the difference between the good and bad ones.
Yeah, I agree. I love what you said. If we're the ones taking away the rights, we should be the ones working meaningfully and helpfully with people. It's our obligation. um, you say on page 191, my uncomfortable conclusion after years of research is that, on balance, there are more people in California who desperately need an LPS conservatorship than are receiving it. It's deeply unfair It's a deeply unfair consequence of our colossal collective failures as a society that without forced treatment, some individuals won't survive long enough to benefit from the reforms I've proposed. That's kind of what you just said, uh, in some different words, but um, I, I hate the idea that we have to do conservatorship, but I absolutely agree. I just don't know what we could do otherwise. Um, but we
In
have to
some
do
cases,
it.
and I think that's the same thing about locked facilities, that uh, our long-term vision the ideal mental health system is one with zero locked facilities, and that
Yeah.
sounds ridiculous, except that in places like Trieste, Italy, there really is very, very little care at that restrictive level. But the situation we're in right now is one in which, again, like I think there are pilots of conservatorship that have tried to sort of get around the hospitalization, and they've just have really struggled to keep everyone out of these highly restrictive settings. Uh, so I think we can't just ignore the question of, okay, what does it take to make these settings better?
Yeah. Well, there's the program, and then there's the conservator.
Hmm.
So the program sometimes says, this person is ready to go. But the conservator, especially if it's a family member, will say no, they need to stay there. And renewal comes up and it just gets renewed.
Hmm.
Um, Other times the program will say, we're just getting a good handle on this, working with so-and-so. And then the conservator calls and says they're moving him tomorrow. So I see an opportunity for a much more recovery-oriented conversation between program and conservator,
Hmm.
where and maybe the person guides that. Obviously it should be their plan on how they're going to get out of there, what they need to learn to get out of there. Um, I appreciate Crestwood's process of trying to make that more real. But even in Crestwood, I'd like to see the person's voice come forward more
Hmm.
as a true partner in planning their services and planning their discharge.
I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of finger pointing around this, but I do want to highlight, I think it's a really important point, uh, that I think, advocates for disability rights and patients' rights, they understand this idea that even though we're having this conversation of, oh, it's too hard to conserve people, there are people in locked facilities in California who have been there too long and by no standard, ought to be in that kind of a situation.
Right, right.
And and meanwhile, we're having this conversation that there's not enough places in these settings, but actually, a significant number of these beds in these settings are occupied by people who shouldn't be there. I mean, the statistic for San Francisco General Hospital, their psychiatric unit, is that 75% of the people at any given time don't meet medical necessity criteria. And they're stuck in this incredibly restrictive, incredibly limiting, for many people, very traumatic, but certainly not skills building or independence oriented setting of an acute hospital, sometimes for years, because of a lack of investment. I mean, I think there's a lack of investment in step down options. There's also a question of that I think you're getting at about risk, that letting people out of a hospital is also about accepting that it could go wrong. And I think, some public guardians and especially families can really struggle with that. They've seen their family members
Mhm,
live with risk and it hasn't gone well for them.
mhm, mhm.
So, but I think that's a really important when we talk about Prop One, building new facilities. We should, the fact that it seems like there's not enough beds in hospitals, that might not really mean that we need more beds in hospitals. It might mean that we need more beds in the kind of less restrictive settings that would help clear out hospitals
Mhm.
faster.
I absolutely agree with that. I would love to see that. Um, Crestwood has done some of that. They have some programs that are licensed as, I think, community care facilities that
Mhm.
are unlocked, they're good step downs. And maybe that's the only other license there is. But they're carried out in different ways. I'd just like to see like a whole lot more of that
Yeah.
because I think that's where people get stuck the most is not having a place to go. And, I don't want to say be too negative, but sometimes if you step down to a board and care, it's worse than being in a locked facility.
Yeah,
It's
there's less
just,
support, there's less happening.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I think when we talk about step down, it's not parking somebody in a boarding care. I mean, that might be the right situation for some people, but it's about continuing a process of intervention that is geared towards recovery. So,
Yes.
again, it's more about, I think some of the most promising places I saw were these augmented boarding cares or, residential treatment programs. That again, it's not somebody isn't just sort of being left. Step down doesn't mean just being left somewhere permanently. It's about, continuing to support somebody's growth and recovery in a less restrictive setting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You know, at the end of your conclusion, you have a story that speaks to this. I'm just going to read it.
Mhm.
Um, so this is a young pregnant woman, and by some miracle, the ER physician convinced hospital administration to let her stay the night. The first responder I was shadowing went in to get a look at her so we could identify her back out on the streets after she was discharged. When we peeked in, she was sleeping soundly. Over the course of a few hours that evening, she had seen the police officers who had put her on a hold, the paramedics who transported her, the ER physician and psychiatrist who evaluated her, a host of techs and nurses who offered care and comfort, and the discharged social worker who was pleading for help finding a shelter. Thanks to them, she had a tray of half-eaten food on her bed, a hospital gown, and a roof over her head, food, clothing, and shelter. In the morning, she'd be gone and back to being gravely disabled. I'm so moved by that story because it's so real and it's not an isolated story.
Mhm.
And I thought it so beautifully and poignantly points to the problem and some of the solution. Do you want to speak to that in any more depth?
Well, I would say that some would consider me naive in this, in that some of the people I interview who have been through psychiatric treatment have experienced really direct and awful abuse at the hands of professionals in the system.
Yeah.
So that's real, and that needs to be addressed. It needs to be part of any conversation we're having about this, and recognizing that there's just an inherent, incredibly strong risk of abuse anytime we're placing people in situations where they can't leave, where they don't have, they're cut off from communication. Like that's just a really central risk. But the way in which I'm naive is that I'm mostly, and I think sociology trains us to think about the world as people making the best out of really difficult structures and systems. And I feel that mostly what I see is professionals, most of them could be doing something much more lucrative than providing services to people with severe mental illness. And they're doing it anyway, and they're trying to do their best within a broken system. And I think that's where it's kind of extraordinary the amount of mobilization, in some cases compassion and dedication that goes into getting outcomes that seem like they're really quite basic and that are very temporary. Like, look at all of these people who mobilized around this young woman who was pregnant, struggling with schizophrenia, meth use disorder, homeless. All that mobilization of resources, and what they managed to do was to get her housed, fed, and clothed for one night. And then she was going to get kicked out of the hospital. And so there is a, there's an incredible disparity in the kind of effort and labor and compassion that can go into the system in some cases, and the, kind of very limited positive outcomes it can deliver.
You use two words throughout your book. One is humble and one is bold. And
Yeah.
I just thought there were two key words that we need to keep in mind when we try to address these issues around denial of rights and so forth. Because if we aren't humble by the problem and think we have all the answers, then we miss the whole point. And
Yeah.
if we aren't bold, we aren't taking enough risk to identify the problems and try to address them in innovative ways. So thank you for those two words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think humility is really important. I mean, these are also just really challenging conditions. I mean, I think we talk a lot about social structures and poverty, but like schizophrenia is a really challenging and in many cases extremely cruel condition. And I think we shouldn't ignore the reality of the suffering it causes, and just the fact that our treatments, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And I think that's also, humility is about not assuming we have magic bullet solutions that will work for everyone.
Yeah. 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 Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we have so much more to talk about. So at some point, maybe you can come back and we'll continue this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Okay, well, there you have it. Again, the two words that Alex uses throughout the book are humble and bold. And it takes both of those to really take on a situation like conservatorship. The minute we think we know what to do, we better stop and think about the bigger picture. And we got to be bold and try new things. Let's not sit around and pick up our old ideas and flap them in the air and fix them up. Let's get big and fix this thing. If we can make this work, it's going to have an impact on our whole system in such an amazing way. And you'll hear more about that when you read Alex's book. It'll be a lot more coherent than me talking as usual. So anyway, thanks for joining us again. I always love it when you're there. Yeah. You are the good guys. You're the ones who keep coming back to work every day, doing your best, making mistakes, not making mistakes, making things better. So thank you. Thank you all for that so much. Love you very much and see you next time.